What happens when a flight attendant confronts Jungkook mid-flight about the real cost of his fame? A shocking showdown at 30,000 feet sparks a chain reaction no one saw coming. The plane was pristine, as one would expect from a first-class cabin. Rows of wide leather seats gleamed under soft, overhead lighting, with freshly folded blankets and glasses of sparkling water waiting at each station. Passengers shuffled in with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing they had paid a small fortune for the privilege. It was an early morning departure from Seoul to Busan, a direct flight crossing the country. Among the crowd of executives, entrepreneurs, and the occasional celebrity was Jungkook, seated by the window in row 3. Some passengers cast discreet glances his way, a mix of admiration and curiosity. His presence was magnetic, even to those who didn't follow the latest entertainment news. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, he appeared relaxed, scrolling through his phone and occasionally scribbling notes in a pocket-sized notebook. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another traveler, albeit one with the weight of the world on his shoulders. The flight attendants moved with precision, each motion deliberate, exuding professionalism. Among them was Seokjin, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and an unshakable poise. She had been in the airline industry for nearly 2 decades, her experience evident in the way she managed to anticipate passengers' needs before they spoke. Today, though, something about her felt different, an undercurrent of tension that even she seemed to be battling to keep in check. As the plane taxied to the runway, the usual safety announcements played. Seokjin walked through the aisle, her practiced smile in place, her gaze scanning the cabin. But her eyes lingered just a moment too long on Jungkook. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but for anyone watching closely, there was something in her expression, an intensity, perhaps even a quiet resolve. The engines roared as the plane took off, the cabin tilting gently skyward. Passengers settled in, some adjusting their seats for sleep, others pulling out laptops or books. Jungkook leaned back, earbuds in, staring out at the shrinking cityscape below. Everything seemed routine, ordinary, even as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. But not for long. Seokjin appeared again, this time carrying a tray of drinks. She moved with the same grace as before, but her eyes darted toward row 3, locking briefly on Jungkook. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face before she approached him. "Mr. Jungkook," she said, her voice steady but slightly lower than usual. "Could I have a word with you privately?" The cabin grew quiet, heads turning subtly toward the scene. Jungkook looked up, his expression neutral but curious. "Of course," he replied, unplugging his earbuds and gesturing for her to continue. But she didn't move. Instead, she stood there, tray in hand, as though wrestling with an invisible force. The tension in the air was palpable now, rippling through the cabin like an unspoken question. Passengers exchanged glances, wondering what could possibly warrant this level of attention. Then, almost imperceptibly, Seokjin's grip on the tray tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line before she spoke again. "Actually," she said, her voice firmer now, "I think it's something the entire cabin should hear." But no one could have predicted what would happen next. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted instantly. Conversation ceased, and even the faint hum of air circulation seemed quieter. Seokjin's words hung in the air, daring someone to question her. Jungkook tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone measured but tinged with curiosity. His response only added to the growing tension. Seokjin took a small step back, lowering the tray to a nearby surface. Her hands were steady, but her eyes carried a fire that wasn't there moments before. "Yes," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers leaned closer, others straightened in their seats, trying to piece together what was unfolding before them. One man in a tailored suit whispered to his companion, while an older woman adjusted her glasses, clearly intrigued. Seokjin didn't flinch. "It's not every day you get to address one of the most famous people in the world," she began, her voice unwavering now. "But with that fame comes responsibility, and sometimes people in your position need to be reminded of that." Jungkook blinked, his expression unreadable. If he was offended, he didn't show it. "I'm listening," he said simply, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped on the tray table before him. Seokjin's eyes swept the room, momentarily locking with a few passengers who quickly averted their gaze. "You've built an empire," she continued, her voice gaining momentum. "You've pushed the boundaries of entertainment, even how we think about the future. And yet," her voice faltered, but only for a moment, "and yet there are people who've paid the price for your ambitions." A murmur rose from the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances. Was this about BTS? Something else entirely? The ambiguity was maddening, pulling everyone deeper into the unfolding drama. Jungkook leaned back, his expression now tinged with something resembling amusement. "Are you suggesting I've wronged you personally?" he asked, his tone calm but probing. "Or is this about something larger?" Seokjin's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "Let's just say it's not about me," she replied. "It's about the people who never get to sit in seats like these. The ones who've lost jobs, livelihoods, families because of decisions made in boardrooms far from their reality." The tension in the room thickened. A man in the back of the cabin let out a low whistle, quickly stifled by a sharp glare from his seatmate. Jungkook's gaze narrowed, his mind clearly working to dissect her words. "I'm sorry if my work has caused harm," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of sincerity. "But I believe in moving humanity forward. That's always been my goal." Seokjin let out a soft laugh, one that carried a weight of frustration. "And who defines forward, Mr. Jungkook? The people at the top, or the ones you leave behind?" The cabin was silent now, save for the occasional creak of a seat or the distant hum of the engines. Every passenger was glued to the unfolding confrontation, unable to look away. But then Seokjin said something that would change everything. Her next words dropped like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stunned cabin. "You don't get to hide behind the guise of progress when real lives are affected," she said, her voice rising. "Do you even remember the faces of the people who've been displaced? The workers who've been pushed aside so you can expand your vision? Or are they just numbers on a balance sheet to you?" Jungkook's calm exterior finally cracked, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He adjusted his posture, sitting straighter, and glanced around the cabin. It was clear that the entire first-class section was hanging on their every word. "I think you're making some pretty bold assumptions," he said, his tone clipped but still controlled. "I've always tried to do what's best for humanity. Not every decision is perfect." "Easy for you to say," Seokjin shot back. "You're not the one who has to choose between feeding your kids or paying rent because a factory closed down overnight. You're not the one who watches their community crumble because automation replaced their jobs." A young man seated nearby, likely a tech entrepreneur himself, leaned closer to the edge of his seat. He wasn't the only one visibly drawn into the exchange. Across the cabin, passengers were nodding, frowning, or whispering to one another, clearly divided on the issue. Some sympathized with Seokjin, while others seemed defensive, perhaps aligning with Jungkook's perspective. Jungkook ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I understand that there are challenges," he said, "but you're painting me as some kind of villain, and that's not fair. I've invested in clean energy, in education, in technologies that will benefit generations to come." "Generations to come?" Seokjin snapped, her voice thick with sarcasm. "What about the generations right now? What about the parents who can't explain to their kids why they lost everything?" She stopped abruptly, her face contorting with an emotion that seemed out of place. Pain. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, and it was clear that this wasn't just about corporate policies or faceless masses. It was personal. Jungkook noticed the shift too. His gaze softened, his earlier defensiveness giving way to something more thoughtful. "Is there a specific story you're trying to tell me?" he asked. "Something I need to hear?" Seokjin's jaw tightened, as if debating whether to say more. The cabin was utterly silent, every pair of eyes locked on her. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and spoke. "My brother," she began, her voice quieter now. "He worked for a company that supplied parts to a major tech firm. He gave everything to that job, late nights, weekends, even holidays. Then one day, they announced they were cutting costs outsourcing. Just like that, hundreds of people were laid off. No warning, no severance. He didn't take it well." Her words hung heavy in the air. Jungkook's expression shifted again, this time to one of genuine concern. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said softly. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Seokjin replied, bitterness creeping back into her tone. "Because you're too far removed to see the ripple effects of your decisions." The cabin felt like it was holding its collective breath, waiting for Jungkook's response. But before he could speak, another voice broke the silence. "I lost my job too," said an older man seated a few rows back. His voice was steady, but his words carried years of pent-up frustration. "I worked for 20 years at a plant that closed after automation. It's not just her brother, Mr. Jungkook. There are a lot of us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. More passengers began chiming in, sharing their own experiences or expressing support for Seokjin. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of raw emotion and collective catharsis. But just as it seemed the tension couldn't escalate further, a sudden announcement from the cockpit threw the entire cabin into chaos. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the cabin's charged atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a technical issue and will need to make an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and fasten your seat belts." The tension in the cabin, already high, exploded in a palpable anxiety. Passengers exchanged worried looks, whispers of what kind of issue, and are we safe filling the air. Even Jungkook's composed demeanor faltered as his eyes flicked toward the window. Seokjin, however, didn't budge. She stood rooted in place, her focus still locked on Jungkook. "You hear that?" she said, her voice sharp. "Even up here, where everything's supposed to be perfect, things can go wrong. Imagine living like that every day, uncertainty hanging over your head, wondering if the next move by someone more powerful will shatter your life." Jungkook opened his mouth to respond, but a sharp lurch of the plane interrupted him. Gasps and yelps erupted from the passengers as the aircraft dipped slightly before stabilizing again. The captain's voice returned, calmer this time. "We are not in immediate danger, but we're heading for an emergency landing at Gimpo International Airport in Seoul. Please stay calm." The announcement barely registered for Seokjin. She turned to the other passengers, gesturing broadly. "You see this? This fear? This uncertainty? It's what so many people live with every day. And it doesn't take a faulty plane. It takes one executive decision, one stroke of a pen." Jungkook leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You've made your point," he said, his tone sharper now. "But blaming me for everything wrong in the world won't fix it. I've spent my life trying to solve problems, not create them. And maybe that's the problem," Seokjin shot back. "You think solutions are about machines and technology, but they're about people, Mr. Jungkook, real people with real lives and real struggles. When was the last time you stepped out of your bubble long enough to see that?" The plane dipped again, this time more abruptly. A child's cry pierced the air, followed by the soothing murmurs of their mother. The cabin crew sprang into action, moving down the aisles to reassure passengers and secure loose items. The co-pilot's voice came through the intercom, urging everyone to brace for landing. Still, Seokjin stood her ground, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. But as the plane began its descent, Jungkook did something no one expected. He leaned back in his seat, closed his notebook, and looked at her directly. "You're right," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't always see the human cost, but I'm here now listening. What do you want me to do? The simplicity of his question caught everyone off guard, including Seokjin. For a moment, her resolve wavered, and she seemed unsure how to respond. But before she could, the plane touched down with a jarring thud, the screech of tires on the tarmac reverberating through the cabin. The confrontation wasn't over, not by a long shot. What happened on the ground would take the situation to an entirely new level. The plane rolled to a stop on the tarmac, emergency vehicles already lining up beside it. Passengers exhaled collective sighs of relief, though the tension from the confrontation between Jungkook and Seokjin lingered like a storm cloud. The captain's voice came through again, steady and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely. Please remain seated while we assess the situation. Seokjin's composure began to crack. For the first time, she looked unsure, as if the weight of everything she'd unleashed had finally caught up with her. Jungkook, on the other hand, remained calm. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You have my attention," he said, breaking the silence. "You said this isn't just about your brother, that it's about people like him. Tell me exactly what you want me to understand." Seokjin hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin. Passengers were watching her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, support, and skepticism. The moment felt heavy, as though the next word she spoke would define everything that had happened and what would happen next. "I want you to see them," she said finally, her voice quieter but still steady. "The people who've been left behind, the ones who didn't get to board this flight, let alone sit in first class. It's easy to talk about innovation and progress when you're insulated from the fallout." Jungkook nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And how do I do that? How do I see them the way you want me to?" "Start by listening," she said. "Not just to people like me who happen to cross your path. Go to the factories that have been gutted by the pursuit of efficiency. Talk to the families who've been displaced, the workers who've been replaced. Hear their stories." The cabin was silent, the drama unfolding like a live theater performance. Even the flight attendants assisting passengers couldn't help but glance over, drawn in by the raw honesty of the exchange. Jungkook leaned forward, his hands clasped on the tray table. "What happened to your brother?" he asked. "How is he now?" Seokjin's face softened, the anger giving way to something more vulnerable. "He didn't make it," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He couldn't find work after the layoffs. The stress got to him." The weight of her words seemed to settle over the entire cabin as Jungkook's face darkened, the gravity of the situation finally hitting him. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time it sounded genuine. "I didn't know." "It's not about knowing," Seokjin replied. "It's about doing something." Just then, the plane door opened, and a wave of fresh air flooded the cabin. Emergency personnel entered, checking on passengers and ensuring the plane was safe. The mood shifted slightly, but the intensity of the conversation lingered as passengers began to disembark. Jungkook stood and approached Seokjin. He extended a hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I won't forget this." Seokjin hesitated, then shook his hand. "Don't just remember," she said. "Do something about it." Jungkook gave her a small nod before turning to gather his belongings. Passengers murmured among themselves as they exited the plane, some stopping to offer Seokjin words of support or gratitude. Others glanced at her warily, unsure what to make of the scene they'd just witnessed. But what Jungkook did next would prove that this wasn't just another dramatic moment. It was the beginning of something much bigger that a few weeks later, headlines began surfacing in news outlets across the country. Jungkook meets with displaced factory workers in Busan, one article read. Another reported, Jungkook pledges $100 million to job retraining programs for communities affected by automation. The stories detailed Jungkook's visits to struggling neighborhoods, his efforts to engage with workers and families whose livelihoods have been upended by technological advancements. For Seokjin, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after becoming an unexpected symbol of accountability. She returned to her job as a flight attendant, though she noticed a subtle shift in the way passengers treated her. Some recognized her, offering smiles or quiet nods of encouragement. Others avoided her altogether, perhaps uncomfortable with the idea of confronting such raw truths. One afternoon, while preparing for another cross-country flight, Seokjin received a package at her airline's office. Inside was a handwritten note and a check made out to a non-profit organization that supported families affected by layoffs. The note read, "Seokjin, thank you for opening my eyes. This is just the beginning. Jungkook." She folded the note carefully, a faint smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wouldn't bring her brother back or undo the damage already done. But it was something, a small step toward change, a ripple that might grow into something greater. That Seokjin's story became a reminder that even the most powerful individuals could be held accountable. That real change often begins with one voice daring to speak up for those who have been left behind. As the plane ascended into the sky on her next flight, Seokjin glanced out the window, her reflection faint against the clouds. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope.